Hello everyone. This is my first time conducting such a hands-on workshop on something as grand and wordy as paleography and codicology. I'm grateful to Tyler and Thibaut for the opportunity, but I've been very much a kind of content person, the kind that we're trying to move away from, as we saw in the first session. I've been working with printed texts, printed editions of older manuscript texts, and it's only in recent years, as part of a long-suffering book project, that I have finally moved to actual Modi script manuscripts in Marathi. So this is very much an opportunity for me to share what I have learned, what I am learning, and air some of my ideas, arguments in front of you. I see this not so much as me teaching you how to read these, but working together with all of you. And I'm not working on literary texts or the kinds of beautiful manuscripts that we saw in the morning. I mean, I would be very happy to actually sing some of this, but these are not texts that lend themselves. This is not material that lends itself to any kind of musical performance, unfortunately. This has to do with documents of state, documentary forms to do with property, distribution of rights, record keeping, which started in Marathi in the 16th, 15th century, really deepens in the 16th and 17th century. So what I'll be speaking about is a particular form called the Kaulnama, but through the Kaulnama, what I hope to do is also raise some general questions about the Modi script archive over the early modern, as we might call it, and think about some challenges that we have when approaching such documents, such materials, how we might approach them, what kinds of arguments they might lend themselves to. So this is perhaps a bit more historical than just manuscript or logical, because a lot of this material has not really been looked at. So what I'll do is, first I'll place these in historical context, the Kaulnama, and look at how they've been treated by historians and so on, and then think about how looking at the actual manuscripts might actually move us towards new ways of thinking about them, right? So let's just quickly look at the Kaulnama to get a sense of what it is we are talking about. It's basically an assurance, a document which grants an assurance. Now, the original Arabic meaning of qawl is word or utterance, and also in the sense of giving one's word. And in Persian, or the sort of bilingual and biscriptural Perso-Hindavi Kaulnama that proliferates in northern India during the Mughal times, during the Mughal state, is what Nandini Chatterjee has described as a declarative document. It specified a promise, one's word, to potential allies. It spelled out clauses of treaties concluding between powers, as well as contractual agreements between the state and rural gentry regarding agrarian settlements and taxes owed. I'll speak about the sort of Persianate dimension of this a bit later. Here, let me just say that the Marathi Kaulnama draws on this Persian form, and the word kaul has also expanded in Marathi usage, as we can see. This is from the famous Date dictionary of the early 20th century. The kaul is defined as vachan, ashwasan, अभय, जमिनीची लागवड करण्यास किंवा व्यापार करणाऱ्यास सरकारचे अभयपत्र करार कबुलायतीचा कागद देते तो. So it's a promise, an assurance, a document of various kinds, which signifies an assurance or agreement between the state and parties, traders or peasants, about cultivation or trade, and the terms of revenue and so on. Now, there's also different ways in which the Kaulnama is talked about in Marathi diplomatic letters and so on, where there seems to be a sort of relationship between the Kaulo Karar or Kaul Karar as it is called in Marathi and the Kaulnama, which is a kind of document produced by both parties specifying what their terms are regarding the Kaul Karar or the agreement between them. There are certain differences between the way it appears in the Mughal and the Maratha forms. But I was sort of pulled up by somebody at a presentation once where they told me that I'm not pronouncing the Kaulnama correctly. I should be saying Kaulnama. And I think that's also one of the things in Marathi, which is one of the reasons why I also wrote the diacritical form here. It really is pronounced as Kaulanama, right? There's no Ka in Marathi. So the Marathi form is very much a sort of simple Kaulnama, even though it comes from an Arabic original word. Now this is a Kaulnama given by Shivaji Bhosle, Chhatrapati from 1674. This is from 1670-71. This has his seal over there, and it's a document. Kaulnama Ajarakta Khane Rajashri Shivaji Raze Sahib Dam Daulat Hu Ta to Bhatani व समस्त भिक्षुक भटानी त्रिंबक कर कस्बे त्रिंबक सुहूर सन इहिदे सबैन अलफ कौल नामा यैसा जे Vedamurti and so on. It goes on. It's a document, and I'll talk about the form a little later. It's a assurance given by Shivaji from the department, from Shivaji's office to the Brahmins and mendicants of Trimbak near Nashik, that who have complained that his people, his officials, are harassing them. The details of the harassment are not mentioned, but they are harassing them, and he has given them a Kaulnama saying that henceforth they will not harass you. So this is an assurance to you. This document specifies that my officials will not harass you anymore. And then it has his seal at the bottom, which says Maryadeyam Virajate, which also I'll come back to a little later. So this is a very kind of skeleton Kaulnama. There are many such forms which proliferated over the later 17th and over the 18th century. The word Kaul actually has also proliferated in Marathi usage more broadly as also something that the deity gives. So you ask the deity about a dilemma, and if the flower falls or something, it means that the deity has given the Devatene Kaul Dila. It has given a sort of decision about which way you should go if you happen to be on the horns of a dilemma. It's also a more general term for forgiveness and so on. So let me just ask, are there any people who are Modi literate here? Does anybody, has anybody had any lessons in Modi script at all? Does anybody have any experience with reading printed Devanagari transcribed Modi documents for? Okay. No, so that's fine. That gives me an idea of how basic I need to kind of make this as well. So not to worry. So like I said, the Kaulnama is usually granted in response to news, a request, or a petition from someone, usually a local official who's also named in the document. He's not named in this one, but or is he? Oh, he is. See, it says Vedamurti Abade Dherge Yanni Malumat Kele Ki Sahebache Lok Yeta Zata Apnas Tasvis Detati. So Vedamurti Abde Dherge came and informed Shivaji that these people are being harassed by the officials, and in response to his news, this document was given. a large number of what we might call agrarian kaulnamas, which I will also discuss in detail below, granted permission to people to bring fresh land under cultivation. And that's really how people understand the Marathi kaulnama also, because as the largest kind that we have in the archive, it's mostly given to people for extending cultivation. Now, sometimes, here the harassment is not mentioned, but a couple of formulaic statements about such harassment will also kind of identify a document as a kaulnama. And sometimes when the background to the assurance or the agreement that is arrived at in the document is extensively described, the narrative structure is not unlike other more kind of narrative forms that we have in Marathi, such as the bakhar, the kaifiyat, and so on. Any people familiar with the bakhar or the kaifiyat, which are different kinds of narrative genres in Marathi from the sort of 17th century onwards, used in judicial disputes and so on. Shumit Guha has written about these as well, where two parties would present their background or their testimonies, which would be narrativized, bringing different contexts, local contexts and events into the story. And this formed the basis for the emergence of Marathi history writing as well, right? So sometimes that kind of historical narrativization you also find in the kaulnama, but not as extensively as you do in the bakhar or the kaifiyat and so on. These are much more kind of focused documents. Now, this is the first document that I will discuss, and I have it over here. This is the entire one, just to give you a sense of its visual nature. Like the earlier session, I mean, we saw that these are scrolls, right? Sometimes these are maintained as scrolls. You have these kind of vertically rectangular pieces of paper that are joined to each other sequentially, but rather than rolled into a scroll, these are kind of folded accordion style, you know, so you kind of can open them up like that. They make for very difficult scanning into A4 or A3 for our purposes today, but you know, they formed a different kind of archiving practice. Across the medieval Deccan, kaulnamas like these, to bring waste or fallow land under cultivation, were given on behalf of the ruler. These were issued from the Diwan Thana, being the kind of office of the state, usually to the level of the Deshmukh, who is really the kind of nodal point of revenue collection, local chiefs with a lot of power who were the interface between the peasantry and the larger kind of revenue collecting state apparatus. These documents often specified the precise terms of revenue. Some of them had istawa clauses. What are istawa clauses? These are time-bound graduated increases of revenue over 5 or 7 years as an incentive to poorer lands. All right. So you are given a kaulnama to bring wasteland that is outside the village, has never been cultivated, is in very poor condition. You are given the incentive to bring it under cultivation, but because you have to put in a lot of effort initially, there won't be any revenue, say, for the first 3 years, right? In the 4th year, it will be at 1/4 of what the usual revenue is. In the 5th year, it might be half, and then from the 7th year, you will be charged at the actual rate and so on. So these istawa clauses vary depending on the context. And similar such kauls were granted to individual seths and mahajans, merchants and moneylenders, for the settlement and improvement of pets and kasbas, market towns. and exhorted cultivators to stay and cultivate existing land, providing assurance and protection in difficult times. So this is also a situation where frequent warfare, frequent forays into areas by different armies for revenue and so on makes cultivation unstable. Populations are apt to flee, and kaulnamas are given to enterprising, say, chiefs or bands of people who can then make people come and settle in areas with the assurance of no harassment, no worry and so on, so that they can actually bring the land under cultivation for a stable period of time. So this is one such, which I'll look at a little bit later. What I also want to emphasize is that the Kaulnamas is not just issued by the state as something that's like high up there, but at the level of the Deshmukh also we have Kaulnamas that are issued. This is one that we will look at, which is issued by one quite well-known Deshmukh, the Pisal Deshmukh family of based in the village of Ozarde in the Vai Pargana, about 90 kilometers south of Pune and about 20 kilometers from where I grew up, which held the Deshmukhi Vatan, meaning hereditary office, as well as the related one of Deshpande, meaning the Pargana level accountant, right? This Kaulnama is issued by two brothers, Dattaji Keshavji and Suryaji Firangaji Pisal, and given to village headmen and various people in their jurisdiction. I was able to get 5 Kaulnamas that these two brothers, these cousins, issued in the year of 1698 from Anuradha Kulkarni at the Bharatitya Samshodak Mandal, and some of them are due to appear in the next volume of the Shivacharitra Sahitya. So the Shivacharitra Sahitya is a long-running kind of set of volumes that have collected materials that are relevant to a history of Shivaji and Shivaji's times, and it's an extensive, wide-ranging sort of collection of documents from various families and a variety of documents and so on, which are in print. What kind of Kaulnamas do the Pisal brothers issue, right? So one they issue to a trader of Kasbe Bazar, Rahimatpur, granting the trader a piece of land measuring 1 tawar for settling the area with cultivators and building new houses. It instructed him to settle this piece carefully, enjoy his rights and privileges, and also specified that a Diwani Parwana, meaning a kind of separate order from the Diwan Thana, had also been issued accordingly. They issued another Kaulnama to the headman of a village, granting him permission to settle a barren village. For doing so, he was granted an inam, meaning rent-free land nearby. A third Kaulnama was issued to Mullah Musa Mujawar, granting his request for the allotment of some part of his inam to the mosque. So there are many such that are issued regularly from the office of the Deshmukh. This one, which one is this? Okay, this is the one from Rahimatpur, which we will look at again. Now, an earlier generation of scholars who used and wrote about such administrative materials had a very functionalist approach to them, right? And to state and administration in general. So this scholarship sought to describe how things were intended to function, like in your civics textbook, right? We did this in civics class. The roles of different offices, their rights and duties, and their limits on their power. Civics textbook doesn't tell you how bureaucracy actually functions. And so also that kind of administrative, history doesn't really tell you what actually the administration was like. The scholarship focused on organizing principles and inherent properties of various institutions and offices, with the implicit assumption being that this is how they normally function, and any variations are then treated as either aberrations or as decline. Right? So within such a framework, the Qaulnama appears primarily as evidence of centralized agrarian improvement and interest by medieval rulers in people's welfare. So because you have a lot of statements regarding stay in your place, there will be no harassment, extend the cultivation, be happy, and so on. This is seen as a kind of articulation of a medieval or early modern welfare state, which in the colonial period was also used by nationalist historians to kind of tell colonial historians that no, see, the state had a kind of theory of welfare. It was for the people, it was good. And in this slide, if we look at the documents of the Pisal Deshmukh cousins, they are exemplary officials. They perform their bureaucratic job and discretion. They produce the paperwork, all this paperwork which ended up as archives for scholars like us, and through them we get a sense of what the Deshmukh's job was. Now, this approach is really what the article by Frank Perlin, which I had sent you, which I don't want to ask how many people read, but working on the assumption that at least some of you did, or if you're familiar with his work, he's critiquing this kind of functionalist approach, right? He and many others are arguing that these states, like we look at them, the Mughals, the Marathas, Vijayanagar, and so on, if we treat them functionally like this, we get the impression, a false impression, that they were all stable, very separate, sort of easily compartmentalized entities, which in a sense they were not when we look at bureaucracy or administration as process, right? He argues, he was one of the earlier ones to argue this, and many others have said so too, that when you look at it as these separate entities, it prevents us from actually understanding the messiness of medieval state formation. The positions of headmen, tax collectors, and so on ought not to be seen as simply roles that are fulfilled by people in a larger system, but as active positions that are inhabited by people whose working of those offices affects the very process of state formation itself, right? So Wink, Andre Wink, Stuart Gordon, Sumit Guha, there's Hiroshi Fukazawa, there's a wide scholarship on the Marathas, particularly of this, that the Maratha state was made up of several co-sharers of power in the kingdom, power at different levels, and there were a whole variety of nested hereditary rights of different kinds, rights to the revenue of different lands, different crops, and not just rights to revenue, but rights also to make decisions about what kind of crops will be grown in what part of land, what portion you will get of a particular office, whether you can sell, part of your office or not. That whole kind of panoply of rights is extremely diverse and complex, but it was something that was very, very firmly adhered to and desired by different actors within the state. So medieval sultanates, starting with the Bahmani and then the Nizam Shahi, the Adil Shahi, the Qutub Shahi, and so on, had largely adapted to and incorporated these hereditary chiefs and officials and their rights into a more or less decentralized revenue and military administration. Now, Shivaji's independent Maratha state in the 17th century transforms some of that into a centralized authority, which becomes more so over the course of the early modern. He displaces some of this local power through bureaucratic reforms, ranging from cash payments to central appointments and so on. So one interesting thing is to also see how such documents which grant or issue or protect rights also then transform, right? Not just the Qaulnama, but many others as well. That's part of a history of bureaucracy, that's part of a history of state formation and so on. Now, Shivaji's state was in a sense successful at some centralization, but over the 18th century, the Peshwas and many other states within the Maratha complex nevertheless had to continue to deal with local rights, accommodate, adapt to local rights and authority of different kinds. So what I would say, drawing on Perlin and the others, is that to look at such documents from the level of the Deshmukh onwards and so on, is in a sense to see the state in action. It's to see power sharing, to see the sort of jostling over power in action, because these documents are inseparable from the multiple claimants to such authority in the first place. So the issuing authority itself is quite unstable, with internecine conflicts between family members over shares of hereditary offices and privileges. So it's interesting, if you just see this, right, like I said, you get the idea that, look, here are these Deshmukhs, they're doing their job, they are helping the state sort of enact its welfare duty. But if you place it in the context of all the documents that we have about the Pisal family, you realize that these two were in a bitter conflict over the 1690s and well into the early 18th century about trying to dislodge the other person from the other half of the office, right? So one is actually writing to the Marathas, the other is writing to Aurangzeb, one is still writing to some chieftain of the Adil Shahi state. Each of them is presenting their testimony or their position through different kinds of documents, but at the same time, their seal and their work is going on. So the document actually also is about who then has the authority to carry such a seal, maintain such an authority, and issue these kinds of everyday things about you. You can have this banana plantation, you go and settle 5 houses over there, you can have like 2/3 of this crop, and that sort of thing, right? So my sort of placing this in historical context is then that the fragility of the Kaulnama's assurances, because we have many such documents where people say a Kaulnama had been granted a few years back, but then there was another invasion and we lost all our lands and so on, and so we've come to say we need more protection, and therefore a fresh Kaulnama is issued, sometimes in the name of another king with a different dating system and so on, saying, okay, now for the next 7 years you can have this relief from revenue. So in a sense, it's a fragile document that has to be issued again and again from different quarters, and that paradoxically, the instability of state formation may have actually produced the proliferation of documents like these, right? Everyone who could issued one when they were able to, and only power and posterity could tell whose assurances endured. So that's what makes it a very interesting, in a sense, document to think about sovereignty, to think about authority and power in the early modern state. Okay, so the historiography of sort of Maratha law and property has kind of looked at documents to understand, how rights are distributed and so on. Historians of scribal practice and language, on the other hand, when they approach documents like the Kaulnama, have focused either on broad conventions of bilingual training and so on, or typologies of documents, minutiae of seals and individual words and so on. And I don't want to like beat up on that because I'm going to do some of that myself. But what I want to kind of say is that we need to get these two historiographies in conversation with each other when we look at such documents also, right? What can historians of scribal practice tell historians of law and property, and vice versa. So the Persian language, maybe what we should do is just look at the documents themselves, and then I'll come back to the issue of the Persian in these materials, right? Now, some Kaulnamas are bilingual, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of a bilingual Kaulnama for you today, but a majority of them are Marathi, a very heavily Persianized Marathi, as we will see, and always in Modi script. I said earlier that never was a retroflex so important, and the Modi script with a D, dot under the D, is a script. What do you know about the Modi script? Anybody?
Cursive.
Cursive, yes. Cursive meaning? Running hand, okay. So one letter kind of merges into the other. Cursive for, let's be functional for a minute, for fast writing, right? So a scribal cursive script. There are many legends about the origins of the Modi script. The most popular one being that it was brought back by the Yadava Prime Minister Hemadri from Sri Lanka. And he is seen as the kind of patron kind of saint or the originary kind of scribe in a sense for Marathi. There are a lot of scribal manuals and so on that are ascribed to Hemadri or Hemad Pant as the original sort of bureaucrat. Now, it is a variation on Nagari. Many letters are similar, many are very, very different and so on. And I don't want to make any assumptions about innate ethnic ability to read any script or whatever. It is not as difficult as it is made out. Modi is actually, if I could, anybody can. It takes a while. It's definitely a specialist skill. What I want to emphasize is that it's a specialist skill, and it was also something that developed within family archives, right? So one of the things that Perlin actually develops in his thing is that, in his argument, is that the state emerges out of household administrations and household archives, right? So once you get into a particular household daftar or a household archive, then you begin to understand the kind of curlicues of a particular style of writing and so on. And this was also a kind of skill that was guarded through venal recruitment, through family recruitment for scribes. Like uncles would teach nephews and so on, and they would be then inducted into the job and so on. And so we have localized kind of styles of Modi writing. Generally, scholars have divided Modi manuscripts into Shivakalin, which is Shivaji era, 17th century, Peshwekalin, which is 18th century Peshwa era, and then Ingras Kalin, which is like, anybody who's a Modi reader of some note will turn up their noses at Ingras Kalin, because it's very easy to read compared to the others. But it is a distinct kind of style. But apart from this temporal distinction in Modi's styles of writing, you also have localized regional style. The Tanjavur one is quite distinctive actually, but so is one that you would find, say, in Gujarat, or one that you would find in Karnataka versus in parts of Maharashtra and so on. So this, yeah. Yes, please.
A question that has to do with something that you were mentioning. I think remembering, and I personally have a problem because we find this argument in many contexts, the idea that it would be a kind of cryptograph and something that, you seem to say that the difficulty has to do with the expertise and the fact that it's an acquired skill, not a script that is designed to leave non-specialists out, which is very different. Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some people have emphasized the idea that it was not accessible by people who were not trained in it, and therefore was a kind of cryptic.
Yeah, I would.
The parallel here is, for instance, with Silat Nagari, which is also derived from the professional script, and again, people have said originally it was a secret language. It was a secret. I think it's secret to people who don't know it.
This is secret to you now, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
So
But
you would
yeah, I would definitely say that, this idea about Modi being a cipher is very much a kind of colonial era anxiety about the Modi scribe. and the native scribe and the records which contain so much regarding revenue and taxable resources and so on being opaque to the colonial state. And this is something that I'm working on, but by in the early 20th century, how the script and the scribe in a sense are merged in this colonial imagination, where Nagari then becomes the not just the readable, print-friendly script that is almost automatically legible to everybody, but it is also then sort of seen as democratic because everybody has access to it, whereas Modi becomes the preserve of a few clerks who very jealously guard its skills. So there's a whole discourse about secrecy and opacity surrounding that, which has to do more with corruption in the subordinate bureaucracy and surveillance of scribes and so on, than it has to do with the actual script itself. It has also to do with the fact that the cursive script is not print friendly and therefore cannot be rendered into print and reproducible in the same way. It is definitely a jealously guarded skill, where therefore there are family recruitment patterns. People are not everybody is taught Modi in the 17th and 18th century. Also, there are scribal families and so on. So, but there's a sort of difference, right, between that kind of skill and cryptic. So this is a mid-19th century kind of manual of Modi. I didn't really know what to bring, because I can't. That's interesting. Thanks for bringing that up. So it's called the Pishacha Lipi, I think, because it's also seen as a degraded form of writing. Right, so the article that I shared with you, the Writerly Self, where I've discussed some manuals which talk about this difference that Brahmin scribes particularly kind of make between writing in Nagari and writing in Modi. So devotional, sacred writing is always in Nagari, and or supposed to be in Nagari, and profane or everyday business writing is supposed to be in Modi. But this scriptural division also allows Brahmin scribes in the sort of early modern period to distinguish their ritual status as Brahmins from their profane status, in a sense everyday status, as employees often of Muslim chiefs and so on. So that division also runs along the ritual division. And there are many who like Ramdas, Samat Ramdas, who will sort of say that this is right, like the Balbodh, as Nagari is called in Marathi, is really the better script to write in, and Modi by comparison becomes like the demonic script. Okay, so this is just, I don't know what to do with just this thing, but just to give you a visual sense of the letters themselves. One of the things which makes Modi writing a matter of skill and a matter of kind of experience, in a sense, is that many letters look alike. And I'll show you more of those. And often, especially when you add matras to them and so on, it is difficult to tell which letter it is. Recognizing which letter it is based on context, particularly when you're talking about names of people or names of villages and so on, becomes a matter of skill. So even today, the place where even most experienced Modi readers stumble at is when the name of a Mauza is mentioned. If you were from that family archive or something, you would know probably all the Mauzas in your taraf or your pargana. But now, if you're approaching it afresh, then knowing the name of a particular chief, his sons, his grandsons, or the village is something that is often difficult. Many Modi, many Kaulnamas have Persian seals. This is a close-up of the Pisal Deshmukh seal, and have to thank Nandini Chatterjee for reading this Persian for me. I'm Persian illiterate, and she has this is also kind of like, you know, sort of split subjectivity in the modern when we read these languages, right? I mean, what you might have been skills that were embodied in one person, now after the Anglo vernacular, we have been through the Anglo vernacular age, we no longer have those multilingual skills unless we are in a good graduate program. So this is the symbol of the plow. You can see over there the Pisal Deshmukh Pargana wine, and there are two dates in the seal, the Julus or the regnal year. I think Professor Chandrasekhar can tell us a bit more about that, and a Hijri date as well, and I'll tell you about the dates. Okay, so let's just look at the first document that the first Qaulnama that we saw, and try to kind of break down its components. Right? Am I doing okay for time? Okay. So what I've done is the red ones, not all the words, but some important red words that I have put over there. Can everybody see that in the Nagari? It's there in your handout as well. And for those of you who don't read Nagari, Indian or otherwise, there is also a English transcription with diacritics over there, right? So the Qaulnama, the is a kind of writing convention. Qaulnama, Ajrakta Khane, Kot Janjire, Danda Rajapuri, Be Ism Mahadaji, Ganesh Damle, Daftardar, Pargane Srivardhan, Tarf Marathe, Bidanat. Now, there is a certain sort of pattern for the Marathi epistolary forms, and the ones that I have actually marked in red are ones that come again and again and again in the Qaulnama. And Professor Chandrasekhar was saying in the morning, right? I mean, after a point, the form is something that you have internalized. You just plug in the names.
Persian beginning of any such Vedanat, no.
Yes. Yeah.
Same accurately, but only the script is almost
changed. Yeah. So Bidanat. So the earliest Qaulnama that we have found is from, I think, Malikul Tujar, which was I think the title of Mahmud Gawan of the Bahmani Sultanate of the 15th century, I think mid 15th century. Which is given to the Deshmukhs of the Pune area, basically telling them that they should settle the area and so on. And this is pretty much the form that is then kind of developed and maintained over the 17th and 18th centuries also. So the Dade Qaulnama Aisa Ze. So this is the Qaulnama that is accordingly being given. Kharab be-chirak hoon, zameen kai mudat kharab be-chirak hoon. So the land be-chirak, kharab, right? The land has become dull and spoilt for for a long time. Vairan padli ase, Vairan meaning sort of barren. And then Bad badit karun mamur karavayasi umedwar asa म्हणून तुमचे बाबे. So Bad badit karun is what it says over here, which means you have to sort of proliferate it, right? Populate it, make it prosperous again. Now, the language in this is slightly different from what you would find. It's slightly more Persianized than you would find in a later Maratha era or Maratha state Qaulnama, because this one is issued from Kot Zanjire, Danda Rajapuri. Zanjire? Zanjira ruled by Siddhis. Siddhis were descendants of the Africans who were enslaved and brought to the Bahmani sultanates over the medieval period. Famous enslaved person who is the sort of seen as the father of many state forms, revenue, agriculture, Malik Ambar, right? Yeah. So the Siddhis ruled from the fort of Zanjira, Kot Zanjire, as well as Danda Rajapuri. And it's interesting, the reason why I have included one of these over here is because we see that the language is Marathi, the form is Persianate, but it is not just the Marathas who are using the Marathi form, the language is also kind of proliferating in other states as well, right? So this one is, yeah, what does that come to? 1153. 1153, to which this is the Suhur son. Yeah, so
Shahur is a plural of Shahr. It is for months.
yes, so the Suhur son, which is used for most of the Marathi dating the Marathi documents, is when you add 599 or 600 to it, you get the Christian year, right, or the common era. So over here, what we have is Salas, Khamsen, Maya, Va, Alaf. Right, in yellow over there. The Suhur in blue is the short form for recognizing the year. And if you want to, so most Marathi archives and libraries, books with documents and so on will have one such cheat sheet in the beginning, right? So you plug in now, what is our date? Salas, Khamsen, Maya, Va, Alaf. So Salas is 3, Khamsen is 50. What was the next one? Maya, 100, and Alaf. So you when you add those, you get 1153, to which you add 599 or 600. Now the year begins coincides with the Mruga Nakshatra, 24th of May to 23rd of May. If you know the date, the actual date that might be mentioned at the bottom with the signature, you can match it with the months, with these months, and figure out whether it is later in the year or earlier, and then accordingly add 599 or 600 to it to get the common era. Often the ihide isne, the dates Salas Arba are not mentioned, only the month and the year is there, in which case you can only date it to a kind of band like the earlier one, 1670 to 71. Sometimes you have the actual date and the month as well. So okay, so what are these things in blue? Short forms. Can you take a shot at what the short forms might be? The Ganesh Damle, Daftar Dar, Pra with 2 lines. Prati or Pargani Maskur will come below. It's Srivardhan is mentioned. Srivardhan is the name of a place. Right, Srivardhan is one of the towns on the coast, a bit south of Zanjira. So this is Pargana Srivardhan, Pargane Srivardhan, right? Now this is one of the major, again, specialized skills of learning more. Not as specialized as knowing the kind of localized geography and so on, but nevertheless to know what these are. So you have Pragana over here. It could be, this is Suhur, Su with the 2. Here for some reason our man has helped us out by writing Pragane full. Mazkur meaning aforementioned, right? So this also gives you the formulaic sense of it. They're not going to keep mentioning the names of the towns and so on and so forth, what came before. Over here you see Tumse Babe, let me just, Tumse Babe, Naijuddin व शेख मोहम्मद सुलेमान नाइक मलाजिम सरकार खुद मौजे मजकूर. So Naijuddin has gone and told that Ganesh Damle Daftardar is really a kind of good man to give the Kaulnama to settle a particular area. Now what does Naijuddin, is it Naijuddin wa Sheikh Mohammed Suleiman, as in are these two guys?
No.
Walad.
What?
So Walad, meaning Sheikh Mohammed is Naijuddin's father, right? So son of, right? So now these short forms, again, they stump you the first or the second time. Wal. So this is his full name. We don't have other short forms over here, but I'll show you some others that will. So the ones in red, right? Tumse Babe, Kaul Istave, further down, Mamur Kartil. Now Kirdi Mamuri is a very classic kind of Kaulnama language, right? So settlement and prosperity, to bring settlement and prosperity into an area. Now this pra at the bottom, Don Sale Hasil Maaf Karun, at the very bottom, Badan Siriste pra Istava Mukarrar Karun. Now is that Pargana? It's come up, Pargana. Down there also, is it Siriste Pargana Istava Mukarrar Karun? Istava is not a Pargana. So what could that be?
Permanently.
No, it is Pramane, according to. Alright, so we see here, the meaning is changed. See, so it says Don Bighe Zaminis Don Sale Hasil Maaf Karun. So 2 bighas of land have been given to him.
Istada, request. Istada Mukarrar, continuous request.
Okay.
Yeah, continuous, it is requested continuously to from said year Istava Mukarrar Kaun Sare Maskura Pasun Devla Jata Se.
No, it is not. It is not Istada Mukarrar. See, here it says Istava Mukarrar Karun. It says that the letter that has been given, Arzadastis Yets Vazal Hile. So a letter has been given to the Amaldar accordingly. Tyaz Varun, accordingly, Mamurivar va Mehnativar Nazar Deun. So keeping your attention and efforts on extension of cultivation and efforts, etc. Meherban Hoon, by smiling upon you, 2 bighas jameen has been given with 2 years istava maaf. So 2 years your revenue has been what do you say, exempted, pardoned, yeah. So mukarrar karun sal mazkura pasun devila zat ase. So this is the thing. So you get sometimes confused with what those short forms are, and you have to figure out based on what the surrounding sort of letters are. And some knowledge of Persian, obviously, we sort of helps in this. But again, one of the frustrating things is that the way it is in a lot of actual Persian documents is not the way it will always be in the Marathi one. Now, this is something that really is work that needs to be done, right? So how is the, I don't like this word, but how is the Persian vernacularized, so to speak, right? And here again, Perlin offers a kind of different way of thinking about the way scholars have looked at this always, is that first there was the Mughal, and then it was sort of vernacularized, regionalized, and so on. And then, like Sir was saying in the morning, right? The Persians always tend to look at the Indian ones as some sort of aberration or mutation of perhaps a negative kind. The Maratha ones can tend to be seen like that. But if we look at Perlin's idea of a library of categories, like a library of vocabulary, a city that he says in his article that was floating high above all of these emerging state forms, where these things were up for grabs for everybody to kind of take and use and adapt to their local circumstances, we can understand why there is so much borrowing on the one hand, but also why there is so much variety on the ground, where from small kind of pargana to pargana to pargana, there are both patterns, but there are also a lot of variations. So the skill and challenge of reading these kinds of documents is also then to kind of know how to match these two, like these broad trends and patterns that are emerging in language, in form, in genre, and administrative practice, but also be attentive to how the scribes kept actually adapting them to local circumstances. Does this make sense? Yeah. What is that 62 in the middle over there? You've read it as 62? And you're wondering what 62 is suddenly doing in the middle of this, like a Bassett. But there next to it says Don Bighe.
6 is
So that's not a 6 at all, right? That's a convention which is to like, in when we write checks, when we write an amount, we add a hyphen like that and a dash to say that nothing comes after that. This signifies nothing comes before that, right? So when you start first reading a Modi document, you're like 6, and it's not 6. It's a kind of inverted Nagari 1, as it were. I will show you here. It does look like a 62, no? Okay, now where am I? Let's just.
Sorry, is this an okay time to interject one more question?
Yes.
What is the doing?
Yes, I'm okay. Let me actually just talk about the right away then. So, the is a short form for Dandavat. Dandavat. And Sashtanga.
There are that Persian words, then why Dandavat is totally Sanskrit word, and we are seeing their Marathi words and Persian words. So why is Dandavat in every
I can't tell you why it is there in every Kavalnama, and I have not come to a reasonable sort of argument myself about why it is there in documents like the Kavalnama and not in every letter, for instance. It's not even there in every Kavalnama, right? But it's there in many of them. Now, we have some manuals from the early 19th century, many of whom are probably based on earlier ones, which specify how people of different social groups in the hierarchy, sometimes caste but not always, are supposed to address each other. Okay. Now, in other forms of letters, the materiality of the document itself, you fold it into columns, and then how the address to whom the letter is and where that is placed in relation to those columns is something that marks social hierarchy. If somebody from a lower position is writing to a higher position or vice versa, how that address is placed on the paper has some purpose or has some importance. In one manual that I found from the 19th century, 1853, says that when Brahmins write to people from other communities, they are supposed to write meaning Ashirvad, also meaning Akhandit Ashirvad. So Brahmins bless. And when people from other communities write to others further below them, they write Dandavat. Alright. Now, this is now Damle, if you take as either a Brahmin or a Kayast, then the person who was writing was perhaps writing as somebody to, if I don't know who the actual person who wrote this was, is writing to a Damle, maybe he wrote it for the, but many manuals don't mention this either, alright? So right now I've just assembled all the different kind of arguments that seem to be there for and the. I think there's also some reason to think that this particular caste-based thing is a much later phenomenon than in the 17th century itself. We certainly don't have any manuals from that time that mention this. But it is, let's just say for now that it means namaskar or dandavat.
Before, scriber was someone else and the honor was someone else who want to write this letter. So if they both have the different tasks, then what term they will use?
Sorry, rephrase that. I didn't understand.
The scriber and the honor who want to write letter from his side. So if they both have, whose concept is going on?
The name of the addresser, yeah, not the actual scribe himself.
Ma'am, then what's the meaning of first line with Dandavat? Dandavat call Name Azrak Khane.
So Ajrakta Khane is from the office. Rakhta Khana is the department, you could say, right? Is that a
Wardrobe.
wardrobe? Okay, in Marathi it is rendered as from the daftar of, or from the office of, from the department of. So
In
Aja.
other way, it can be chancellery also.
Okay.
Chancellery.
Okay.
Yeah. In northern term, it used to be from the wardrobe type or the one department which procures the material.
Okay.
For the material culture line.
Okay.
But in this case, it's chancellery.
Chancellery, yeah. So here you can see Kaulnama Ajarakhta Khane Rajashri Shivaji Raje Saheb Dam Daulatuhu. So it's from the office of Rajashri Shivaji Raje. Yeah.
In fact, there is a dictionary, Marathi to Persian.
Yeah.
It was written by Panditji of Shivaji's court.
Rajvyavahar Kosh.
Hmm?
Rajvyavahar Kosh. Yeah.
It was published recently in 2002 again from Delhi.
Yeah. I'll
Yeah.
speak about that a little bit.
All this
Yes, yeah.
technical terminology.
Yeah. Okay, so now if you look at, this is the same one, if you look at these letters, see, this is the first letter that we just spent so much time on, the Kaul Name Ajarakhta Khane Kot Zanjire Danda Rajapuri, right, the first line. But if you look at immediately below it, you think there's another the, right, because it is almost identical. This one is an E, that's Be Isma. So this, the, her, E are, depending on how the scribe wanted to kind of write his strokes, can be quite confusing. So when reading a Modi document, figuring out how these letters are similar. Now here you see this is a Su, all right. This is a Suhutsan. Sa and these are R. This is identical to a ma. Alright? So when I first read it, I'm like, Suma Sakas. Sakas also appears in agrarian document because sakas meaning strong or healthy, fertile land. So I thought, what does Suma Sakas mean? But it doesn't. It's not that. It is it's the short form for Suhur Sun, and this is not Sakas, but it is Salas Khamsen Maya Va Alaf. It's the date actually, right? So now Ka and La are the most frustrating for Modi readers. This can, at first glance, this could be Sakas, it could be Salas. Once you've realized that this is Suhur Sun, this can only be Salas, and then it just like flow very fast, Salas, Khamsen, Mayava. And once you come to the Ma, you don't even, you just go to the next, because you know it's going to be Mayava. So there's a certain formulaic nature to it, but there are some blind spots that can be very difficult. Okay, so do you want to help me pick out the formulaic phrases from this one? I've done the first one, Kaulnama. Pa. After that is Y meaning the name of the town, Pargana, so you know that is Pargana. The Kaulnama, Y, Ta, okay, Ta we didn't have in the earlier one. What does Ta mean? Ta, the short form is Taha, two, right? Then Pargane, yes. This M, 2 dots and R, he couldn't be bothered to write Mazkur, let alone write Pargana Y all over again. So he has written Ma, 2 line, 2 dots and R, Mazkur. Now, so when you come across that, you know what it means is the Pargana that has been referred to earlier in the document, namely Y. So the Kaulnama has been granted by Dattaji Kesharji and Suryaji Naik Pisal to Rev Seti, Vald Siv Seti Setia, Pet Bazar, Ka Rahmatpur. What is Ka? Ka with 2 lines, short form for Kasba. Very good. Yes. Kasba Rahmatpur, Pargane Mazkur, Suhur Sun, 1099. Now this is unusual. You don't have the full Suhur Sun mentioned here. In a lot of these Pisal Deshmukh documents, they've actually just mentioned it in numerals 1099. That's not always seen. It's usually in the full letter form that we saw in the earlier one. So then Dade Kaulnama Aisa Ze. So when you come to these forms, Dade Kaulnama Aisa Ze. Now here's where you know the document's been divided into 2 forms. All this point is like from whom to who, where, it's being placed in space-time, right? Here's where the actual kind of letter begins after this. Yaisa Ze, Badal Abadani Pet, Tuz Inam Zameen Tawar Ekshetis Karun Dilha Ase, Inam Khaun Tamame Rayat Udmi Khalala Anun, Petes Navi Ghare Bandavili. So you enjoyed your Inam and Tamame Rayat Udmi Khalala Anun. So all the Rayat, the peasant, Lajima is all of this. You are now going to enjoy that every year. Divanichi Nazuri Karun Sukhe Ashne. Now this word Nazuri, let me show you over here. Where is, did I come later? Yeah. Here. I showed this to another Modi reader who read it as something else. It could be, it looks like a poo. Often in Modi, pa and poo you write like in Devanagari. Then So she thought it could be Napuzari because this is a z. Z and na are almost alike, so is a l. So we said Napulari, Napuzari, Napunari. But the z is also written like this, so Nazuri. I'm still not sure. This is my stumbling point for this document, right? So Thibaut, to come back to your question, now this is perhaps where, as modern readers, we are also kind of stuck. Perhaps it meant something in a local context that a skilled reader at that time might have been able to just read very, very easily, but I'm not sure what it means. Perhaps it's a Persian word that I'm not familiar with. If I trawled the dictionaries and so on, and I might finally come up with something. It could just be a scribal error. You know, maybe he meant to write something else. Sukhe ashne, this is again a formulaic one. Aise babe shak na karne. This is something that is always told in a Kaulnama. Don't worry, don't fear for any thing. Kone babe shak na karne, andesha na karne. Hello?
Yes, sorry, it phases out.
Okay.
Ma'am, excuse me.
Yes.
That Divanchi Nazuri might be Nazarpur. He could have seen it.
Acha, Nazari.
Nazarpur.
Nazar
might-
Karun, right? Like a
Yes.
present.
Not Nazar Karun. Nazar means to see that he could have seen it. That it is saying about that the person for whom he is writing that he has shown it to the higher officers.
But Diwani, what does Diwani mean?
Divanchi.
Diwani chi means of the Diwani. Now,
It could be a Manjuri.
it doesn't look like a ma at all over there. That's the so. These are all ways now. So Diwanichi Nazuri Karun, what I thought is like paying the revenue. Nazar dena also means like your Nazrana dena.
And Nazar means to see something.
It also
So
means to
Nazar
see,
I-
yeah. But in a lot of documents you also have Nazar Karne, which means to give like a present. So
Just to mention, because this text is very similar to what we get in the revenue documents of Rajasthan,
yes,
where it comes constantly Diwani Hazuri. It could be a misspell.
could be.
Because there constantly it comes as Diwane Hazuri.
Okay. It could well be. That's not a ha for sure, but it could well be a misspelling.
Would have come.
Huh?
If the Devani Suri it would have been, then
Hazuri.
Karun would not have come.
Hazuri.
Divanchi, Nazuri, Karun, because in Persian Arabic script, if we write Nazr and Nazar, then only we can distinguish. Now it is written in Modi script. We do not know whether it was Nazr to offer or Nazr to look at. But at the compound is showing, it is mostly like as a tributes paying amount.
Just like Nazrana.
Yeah, I think it is, but it's very not usually written like this, so it's a slight question mark around it. I'm pointing it out mainly to show where, when reading the manuscript itself, you can go wrong, or if whoever edited this text before you just took a call and wrote something without mentioning that there was some ambivalence regarding it, and then you just go with that person's transcription. That's happened too in the past. Okay, so what is this? Let's just move on. This is an Abhay Patra, right? Now, as Professor Chandrasekhar was saying, talking about the Rajvyavahar Kosh. Now, in 1676, Shivaji authorizes the composition of the Rajvyavahar Kosh, which is really a kind of lexicon translating Persian and Dakhni vocabulary, some administrative and bureaucratic, but a wide variety of vocabulary into Sanskrit, into High Sanskrit actually. A lot of it is our sort of neologisms as well. And this is also intended to reduce the Persian content of these kind of bureaucratic forms, replace them with Sanskritized vocabulary. Many people are under the impression that it translates them into Marathi. It does not. These are Sanskritized replacements, Sanskrit replacements for the Persian and Dakhni vocabulary. And we see then over the 18th century, particularly in the late 17th and early 18th century, that the Abhay Patra emerges as a stand-in for the Kaulnama. So where you might have found a Kaulnama, now you find an Abhay Patra. Yeah. Scholars have seen these two forms as basically interchangeable. The Rajvyavahar Kosh itself mentions that translates the Kaulnama as Abhay Patra. Now, to what extent is this actually reflected in actual documents over the 18th century? There is definitely a decline in Persian words in Marathi bureaucratic documents over the 18th century, right? Particularly in the Peshwa's archive, certainly in letters that in private correspondence of the Peshwas and so on, there is now a sort of noticeable shift from this heavily Persianate language to a much more kind of Marathi and Sanskrit sort of replaced Sanskritized language. But if we see a series of different forms, or if we look at the kind of form in general, what we can see is that both continue to be produced. So we do have Kaulnamas as well over the 18th century, and interestingly we have many examples where a document begins as an Abhay Patra but ends as a Kaulnama Dilha Aisa Ze, and where it would have said Abhay Dila or whatever, it would say Kaul Dilha Aisa Ze. So some formulaic phrases remain, and that kind of ground level sort of scribal work, like is this just a scribe that is used to who is used to a particular set of vocabularies, or it's somebody who says I can't be bothered, don't tell me what language to use, I've been doing this all my life, I'm going to call it this. Those kinds of like scribal histories we still don't have. We have these, we can look at these documents to kind of glean that kind of everyday scribal and writing practice from them. And the Kaulnama Abhay Patra kind of back and forth, I think, is a very productive space from which to do that. So Mortab Shuddh, which is the end Mortab Shuddh would be the end of the writing, marking the end of the writing over here. In many Kaulnamas, you have that as a seal as well, sometimes in Persian, sometimes in Nagari Mortab Shuddh, which in the Abhay Patra becomes Lekhanalankar, Sandesh Samaksha, or Maryadeyam Virajate, which you saw in the Shivaji one. Where is the previous slide? Oh God, we have to go through all these animations. Where is it? Oh yeah, here. See, here you can see the Mortab Shuddh, the Maryadeyam Virajate thing at the end, and you have the seal over here. Okay, where was I? How much time do I have?
I was just going to say we've got a little under 10 minutes.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Just trying to see what I have left out. Okay, now perhaps we can at the end just talk about how these materials have come into the public domain over the last 100 years. Because as scholars, I mean, if you're going to actually look at these documents, chances are if you want to work on something to do with Maratha history, you will start with the published volumes, right? And there are many, many such volumes. My first book was really about this process through which, nationalist historiography collected and brought hundreds of thousands of such early modern materials into the print sphere. And it's a very, very valuable work. We have a huge printed archive of Marathi materials, but how to approach them is a question, a methodological question. In many cases, for instance, you will see that, like I showed you, the and the E looks the same, right? Many early editors didn't actually write it as didn't interpret it as Dandavat, just used it as E as a kind of writing convention. So in early printed editions of letters, you will see it as written, transcribed as E. There are many, many sort of differences over dates. A lot of Modi is transcribed differently. And I mean, that you can kind of, as you go towards the manuscripts, you can compare the printed editions and so on. But sometimes the actual documents are not there, right? You only have the printed editions, particularly for the early volumes that say V.K. Rajwade edited, upwards more than 20 volumes of Marathancha Itihasachi Sadhane. A lot of family archives that he got from people, transcribed into Nagari, printed, and then returned those papers to the families, or maybe they are still in Pune in uncatalogued, in bundles at the Bharat Itihas Sanshodak Mandal. So if you can actually kind of read the Modi in its original sort of thing, then that's great. But in many cases, you have to rely on the Persian, on the printed material. Now this is a very good printed version. This actually is from samagrarajwade.com, where they have actually placed all of these volumes online, and all his other writings. Rajwade, people familiar with Rajwade? V.K. Rajwade, pioneering nationalist historian, early 20th century, who did a lot of this archival work, but also set many of the terms for interpreting Maratha and medieval early modern history more broadly. So a lot of the material that he collected is now up at samagrarajwade.com. Now, in the later volumes, what they did was to actually put these seals up there. Okay, so you can read the seals and the text. Now, the text here you can see both here and in the printed does not actually follow the dimensions of the original manuscript text, right? Which I did over here for you. I didn't go till the end of the page. If you wanted to compare these two, you know where that one ends. But here it's not like that. It becomes one kind of mass of text. In many cases, there are no seals. This is another example. Now these are all where the pages were torn, right? And most problematically, in a lot of early Marathi printed volumes, they just said Farsi Mazkur, Persian material, Persian writing, Persian seal. And if you don't have that actual material, if you don't have the actual manuscript, then you have to just guess at what that Persian might have been. So to think about what the Persianate is in Marathi bureaucratic writing is a problem in the archive itself, because a lot of the way in which it has come into print is also in this way. Now, some of it is nationalist, like we are going to print the Marathi and the Persian was an imposition, it was an invasion, we just kind of mention it. But from the other side, the Persianate has been seen basically as seamlessly infusing the Marathi, and wherever it is, it's seen as somehow similar to the Mughal, as part of this kind of large Persianate cosmopolitan. So if one sees it as an invasive kind of imperialism, the other sees it as a kind of seamless cosmopolitan Persianate. Now, how these choices are made, how these Persian and Marathi kind of vocabularies, suffixes, prefixes, or like I said, between the Abhay Patra and Kaulnama, how these interchanges happen is, I think, somewhere in between these two poles, right? And sometimes the printed archive kind of hinders our understanding of it. Though nowadays, for instance, the later volumes of the Shivacharitra Sahitya, they have printed the original Modi alongside the Devanagari transcription, so that makes it much easier to and very useful. But I thought alongside these printed versions, then I would show you just at the end some examples. Maybe next time we'll have a lot of Modi readers coming back, and then we can like we did in the morning, we can work our way through each line. But right now, you can feast your eyes visually at least on this. This is from the Lakshmeshwar Desai Daftar, Dharwad district today, North Karnataka. Also a multilingual family archive. The Desais were subdued by the Peshwas. They were initially under the Adil Shahis, then the Peshwas, and their archive, the family archives of many Desais are today in the Pune Mandal. You can see their Persian seal, and this is a Kaulnama from the Lakshmeshwar Desai Daftar. This is a very badly fragmented Kaulnama from the Rajaram era, turn of the 18th century, Shivaji's son. Then now here you can see in this one, as well as in this one. This one is from another Rajwade archive, the Rajwade Samshodhan Mandal in Dhule. They too have digitized everything in very high quality scans and put them up online. That website is vkrajwade.com. It has a wide variety of materials he collected. It seems to be offline the last few days, I don't know why, but it's there usually. In Nagari Marathi, Modi Marathi, Persian materials, Sanskrit materials, there's a whole diversity of stuff there. There's no the here. Can you see? No Dandavat. And you have the Mortab Sud seal at the bottom. And so now it makes it very difficult. You can figure out where this is. This is Prant Karad, Umbras, Taluka, Umbras, and you can date the thing. But these many such documents in the archives also are floating around. They're not attached to anymore to the family archives from which they came. So for instance, the Pisal family materials you can actually place in an ecology of documents, right? You can reconstruct the history of that family and how particular documents then participated in a larger strategy that they had vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis other families like themselves, and so on. Such documents there are many, and how to actually make use of them is a challenge for historians. But you guys also have to figure out ways to read these and make sense of them. This is the last one I'll show. This is issued to Kaulnama Rajashri Haibat Rao Bhavani Shankar An Deshmukh व Bhavani Shankar भगवन व येंकोजी गिरमाजी देशपांडे परगना वाई ता भैलानाक bin Bhavanak, and there are series of Nak names. This is given to various brothers of a Mahar family regarding their Mahar Vatan in the Vai area as well. So the Rajwade archive has a lot of documents from this Umras, Karad, Satara, Vai region, which is about sort of 100-120 kilometers south of Pune, but they're not integrated, they're just kind of dispersed around over there. So that's my call nama spiel. I'll take a few questions if I have time. If you have